Hello and welcome to this very timely virtual event on ensuring accountability for sexual violence and conflict. I'm Elaine Verveer and I direct the Georgetown Institute for Women, Peace and Security. From Ethiopia to Myanmar to Ukraine, from Afghanistan to Yemen, Syria and more, sexual violence continues to be used as a widespread weapon of war. This despite calls for greater accountability, including at the recent UN Security Council open debate on sexual violence and conflict. During the debate several weeks ago, representatives of close to 80 governments made statements condemning conflict-affected sexual violence and focused on the need for accountability, for prevention and deterrence. Yet there is a long way to go to ensure that international measures effectively address the global scourge. What will be done about the horrific scale of sexual violence and other violence emerging inside Ukraine? Reports grow daily about sexual abuse, and one of the horrible news stories coming out is of ethnic cleansing, forcing women to bear the children of the Russian invaders. We saw this in the Balkan War and in Iraq with the Islamic State enslaving the Yazidi minority. Even in Bosnia, all these years later, there are still women waiting for justice. The US recently declared what happened to the Rohingya people a genocide. Systemic rape occurred on a massive scale. These are war crimes that must be prosecuted vigorously. Perpetrators, once and for all, must be brought to justice. And that is why gathering evidence, documentation, is so crucial. Today, we will hear from leading experts and policymakers, in addition to the frontline activists from Ukraine and Myanmar, who will share their firsthand accounts and calls for action by the international community. Today, we are also launching a new report on addressing conflict-related sexual violence through multilateral sanctions. The study was generously supported by Global Affairs Canada. Although the report looks at the case study of Myanmar, it provides important recommendations for addressing conflict-related sexual violence in other conflict contexts. We will hear from my colleague, Dr. Robert Nagle, who will discuss some of the key recommendations from the report. And you can also find a link in your chat box. Over 600 participants are joining us on our Zoom platform and many more on Facebook today. And many have already submitted questions to our panelists. I am now pleased to turn to the Honorable Pramila Patten, who is the Special Representative of the United Nations Secretary General on Sexual Violence and Conflict. She is deeply committed to ensuring accountability for conflict-related sexual violence. She has wide expertise on these issues and on women, peace, and security more broadly. Pramila began the open debate at the United Nations Security Council a few weeks ago by asking what the Security Council's 10 resolutions on women, peace, and security actually mean, including the 5 that focus on sexual violence and conflict. What, she asked, do they mean right now for Ukraine, for Afghanistan, for Myanmar, or Ethiopia's Tigray region? She noted conflicts are proliferating with a concurrent rise in attacks on women, noting in particular the horrors unfolding in Ukraine, even as others she described the harrowing personal testimonies of women fleeing the terrible scourge there, and said to see it as a call to action. She has held a range of high-level positions. She brings a passionate commitment and urgency to this mission, and she will be traveling to Ukraine in the next several weeks. Special Representative Patten, it is an honor to have you with us.
Thank you so much, my dear friend Milan. Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. I am really pleased to participate in today's event, hosted by the Georgetown Institute for Women, Peace and Security, whose path-breaking policy research and strategic advocacy demonstrate the importance of gender equality to conflict prevention and durable peace. I would like to thank Ambassador Verveer for her steadfast leadership and for convening this timely event. Today's panel provides a critical platform to amplify the voices of civil society representatives from Myanmar and Ukraine, whose perspectives must guide our global search for solutions. Since the year 2000, the United Nations Security Council has adopted 10 resolutions on women, peace, and security, 5 of which are dedicated to preventing and addressing conflict-related sexual violence. While the normative framework is robust, we are compelled to ask, what do these resolutions mean concretely on the ground right now for women in Ukraine, Myanmar, Afghanistan, and Ethiopia? The Council's resolutions represent a commitment to bring all political, diplomatic, legal, and economic tools to bear to break the seemingly endless cycles of sexual violence, impunity, and revenge, and to save succeeding generations from this scourge. And yet, sexual violence continues to occur and recur with every new wave of warfare. Today's event takes place against the backdrop of multiple cascading crises that undermine the rules-based international order. We know that when the international rule of law is undermined, civilians, especially women and girls, bear the brunt of volatility and violence. We must reassure populations at risk that they are not forgotten and that international law is not an empty promise. We have seen over the past year and a half an epidemic of coup in settings affected by widespread or systematic sexual violence, such as Myanmar, the Sudan, Mali, and Guinea. In Myanmar, following the military takeover in February of last year, sexual violence has been documented against women protesters, political prisoners, and human rights defenders. Following the Taliban takeover of Afghanistan last August, women have been targeted for their work to address sexual violence, including women formerly active in the security sector. In Tigray, Ethiopia, women have been horrifically gang raped at gunpoint. The harrowing images and personal testimonies from women in Ukraine have shocked the conscience of the world. I have repeatedly expressed grave concern about the mounting allegations of sexual violence in Ukraine and called for swift and rigorous investigations to ensure accountability as a central aspect of deterrence, prevention, and non-repetition. Essential civilian infrastructure has been reduced to rubble and ruin, resulting in gender-based violence and reproductive health services being least available just when they are needed most. In the coming days, I will visit Ukraine as a matter of urgency to meet with the national authorities and civil society actors on the front lines as part of efforts to bolster the UN system response. The international community has the tools at its disposal to dramatically increase the cost of wartime sexual violence for perpetrators and would-be perpetrators. But these tools must be matched with the political will and political courage to use them. One such tool is targeted sanctions. The United Nations has 14 sanctions regime, 8 of which now include conflict-related sexual violence as part of their designation criteria, either through a specific reference to sexual and gender-based violence or as part of the broader rubric of violations of international humanitarian and human rights law. Since its inception in 2009, my mandate has had the opportunity to brief 5 of the 8 sanctions committees that include sexual violence in their designation criteria, namely the regime for the Central African Republic, the DRC, Somalia, South Sudan, and Yemen, in order to make targeted recommendations. To date, however, these recommendations have only been sporadically and unevenly applied. As a powerful UN Charter-based tool, sanctions offer significant yet still largely untapped potential to advance protection and compliance with international law. When imposed specifically for sexual violence, they send an unequivocal signal about the gravity of these historically hidden crimes. The imposition of sanctions solely for such acts is a relatively recent and welcome development. Sanctions can curb and constrain the illicit exploitation of natural resources that fund the operations of armed groups and spoilers to the peace in settings such as the Central African Republic, the DRC, and Somalia. Beyond lifting the influx of arms and ammunition or the financing of armed groups, today almost all regimes aim to uphold international humanitarian norms. A gender perspective must also inform the consideration of humanitarian carve-outs and exemptions to ensure that sanctions are not applied as a blunt instrument that complicates the delivery of humanitarian aid in order to avoid adverse, unintended consequences for women. The latest report of the Secretary General on conflict-related sexual violence, compiled by my office, lists 49 parties credibly suspected of committing or being responsible for patterns of sexual violence in situations on the agenda of the Council. Over 70% of persistent perpetrators having appeared in the list for 5 or more consecutive years without taking remedial or corrective action. It is critical to cohere the practice of listing suspected perpetrators and the practice of imposing targeted and graduated measures by sanctions committees to improve compliance. Leveraging the credible threat of sanctions can change the calculus of parties to conflict that operate on the assumption that rape is cost-free or even profitable in the political economy of war, in which women and girls are trafficked, traded, and sold. In practice, very few of these entities are targeted by UN sanctions committees, and none are targeted specifically for sexual violence. This gap is regrettably mirrored in the practice of states in imposing unilateral sanctions. The next generation of national action plans on women, peace, and security should reflect the commitment to impose travel bans, assets freeze, arms embargoes, and other targeted measures in order to deter aggression and deny perpetrators the means of inflicting harm. We need to ensure policy coherence so that states are not directly or indirectly funding and equipping the very violations they oppose. In terms of promising practice, it is noteworthy that 7 of the 8 individuals listed pursuant to the 2206 sanctions regime on South Sudan have sexual violence included in their citation. In 2020, the 2140 Committee on Yemen sanctioned Sultan Zabin, director of the Sana-based Criminal Investigation Department, for his role in a policy of intimidation and sexual violence against politically active women. In addition, last year, the 1970 Committee on Libya listed the de facto manager of the notorious Al-Nasser Detention Center for abuses, including sexual violence. In several cases, the credible threat of sanctions has directly influenced the behavior of belligerents. For example, the risk of sanctions was a factor that prompted the issuance of a command order by Dr. Riek Machar, commander of the SPLA-IO in South Sudan, calling for the release of abducted women and girls in Western Equatoria who had been subjected to sexual violence. Likewise, in the DRC, the threat of sanctions has opened space to negotiate the release of abducted women and girls from armed groups. In cases where the leader of an armed group harbors political aspirations, the imposition of sanctions can undercut their political legitimacy. Sanctions and criminal accountability can yield significant results when they work in tandem. In the DRC, Thabo Taberi Sheka was accused of commanding forces responsible for 387 rapes in Walikale, North Kivu province in 2010. When he attempted to use military force to support his run for parliament, sanctions were swiftly imposed, preventing him from assuming a formal role in Congolese political life. After years as a fugitive, Sheka was prosecuted for these crimes in 2020 and sentenced to life imprisonment by Congolese military tribunal. Yet, these cases represent only a handful of examples, whereas every year, thousands of UN-verified cases of conflict-related sexual violence employed as a tactic of war, torture, terror, political repression, and reprisal are recorded in our annual report. It is therefore critical to strengthen the capacity of national institutions to protect their population and uphold the rule of law. Where governments are unwilling or unable to prosecute perpetrators of conflict-related sexual violence, we must support the work of international courts and tribunals and encourage the use of universal and third state jurisdiction, as in the case of the former Syrian intelligence official Anwar R., who was tried in Koblenz, Germany, for crimes of sexual violence committed in 2011 and 2012. By using the full repertoire of criminal penalties and economic sanctions, we can translate commitments into compliance and resolutions into results. Prosecution is also a form of prevention and deterrence, whereas impunity normalizes violence, visible and consistent accountability reinforces global norms. Ladies and gentlemen, all tools must work in tandem to reverse the emboldening effects of impunity and reinforce the message that the only shame of rape is in committing, commanding, or condoning it. Policymakers must match their promises with meaningful action to leverage behavioral change. Protection from sexual violence, even in the midst of war, is not merely an aspiration. It is a legal obligation. Sanctions are a critical component of wider political and diplomatic strategies to ensure that these obligations are respected, implemented, and enforced. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Pramila, for that very comprehensive overview, for really setting the context for the discussion that will now follow, and for underscoring for us the importance of sanctions and all tools working in tandem, as you said, to address the need for greater accountability and the end to impunity. So thank you for that, and safe travel in the weeks ahead. We are now going to turn to Lynn McDonald, the Director General for International Economic Policy at Global Affairs Canada, for her opening remarks. She has served in other Canadian diplomatic corps posts for over 2 decades, including as legal advisor to Canada's permanent mission to the WTO and as director of the intellectual property and trade policy divisions. She also served as the High Commissioner to Singapore and as Counsel and Senior Trade Commissioner to the Consulate General of Canada in Hong Kong. Lynn, we're so pleased to have you with us. Canada has shown incredible leadership and sustained efforts in preventing and responding to sexual violence and conflict, including pressuring the Kathmandu, the military, for the use of sexual violence and conflict in Myanmar. So welcome.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Vivier. Distinguished panelists, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for the honor of joining you this morning. I would like to start by saying how proud Canada is to support the Georgetown Institute for Women, Peace and Security in this important research. The Women, Peace and Security agenda is at the heart of Canada's feminist foreign policy. And the situation in Myanmar, we believe, is a sobering example of the need to continue to advocate for and support gender equality, promote the empowerment of women and girls, call for the protection of their human rights, and fight sexual and gender-based violence, especially in conflict settings. Canada remains seized by the ongoing crises in Myanmar, the Rohingya crisis, and the worsening post-coup conflict, both of which stem from, of course, unresolved root causes. As many of you may know, our ambassador to the United Nations, the Honorable Bob Rae, previously served as Canada's special envoy to Myanmar, and he remains a strong advocate for action, both within Canada and with the collective global community. Canada continues to pursue a range of measures to advance long-term and durable solution to these crises. We stand in solidarity with the people of Myanmar and their desire for a peaceful, inclusive, and democratic society. In Canada's 2021 budget, it was announced that our country will dedicate $288.3 million to continue our development, peace, and stabilization efforts in Myanmar and Bangladesh. And this will be complemented by life-saving humanitarian assistance for those most in need. We continue to advocate for all marginalized and conflict-affected communities in Myanmar and a peaceful return to democracy. One of the major planks in Canada's response strategy to the crisis in Myanmar has been the use of targeted sanctions to increase pressure on Myanmar's military leaders to engage, restore Myanmar's democracy, and stop the violence. A key word in our approach is targeted. Through the use of targeted sanctions, Canada makes every effort to minimize potential negative impacts on civilians and on legitimate business, humanitarian, or other activities. Canada has also taken a strategic, sequential approach with cascading rounds of sanctions on key dates to maximize visibility and maximize pressure on malign actors. We do this with focus groupings that amplify Canadian foreign policy and target areas of particular concern in complement to other Canadian and joint diplomatic efforts in bilateral and multilateral fora. The most recent round of sanctions targeting arms flow is an excellent example of this approach. Canada also believes that sanctions are most effective when imposed in coordination with like-minded actors. We're proud of the collaborative work undertaken to date with our partners, most notably the United States, United Kingdom, and European Union, and we hope to continue our robust and coordinated approach to sanctions in response to this and other crises. Of course, the need for further action underscores that the global community, including Canada, must continue to learn and improve our response measures. Research and analysis is a critical part of this learning process. Reports like this excellent one written by the Georgetown Institute for Women, Peace and Security are a helpful tool for countries such as Canada. They enable us to take stock of what we've done and consider how we may be able to adjust and fine-tune our approach moving forward to both maximize impact and minimize potential side effects. This report has outlined several recommendations to improve the use of sanctions as a foreign policy tool in response to the Myanmar crisis, as well as for imposing targeted sanctions for conflict-related sexual violence more broadly. Canada is eager to explore these recommendations alongside our like-minded partners and you all, and we sincerely hope that continued dialogue in this sphere will lead to reduced impunity for conflict-related sexual violence and greater support to countries such as Myanmar in creating a more just, equitable, and peaceful future. And with that, I thank you again and look forward to the continuing discussion. Merci beaucoup. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lynn. Thank you for Canada's leadership on these issues and for your own considerable efforts in this space. We're going to turn now to our colleague at the Institute, Dr. Rob Nagle, who is the postdoctoral research fellow doing our work in this space. He is the author of the report we are launching today, Addressing Conflict-Related Sexual Violence Through Multilateral Sanctions. Rob is a respected authority in conflict-related sexual violence and its consequences for international security and post-conflict stability. He was awarded the 2019 Cedric Smith Prize for the Best Peace and Conflict Studies paper and the International Association 2020 Dina Zenas Award. He is a member of the consultative group for the Sexual Violence in Armed Conflict data set. Rob, welcome, and feel free now to walk us through the report, the highlights.
Thank you so much for your kind introduction, and thank you everyone for joining us, and thank you to my distinguished panelist guests as well. It's really great to be with all of you, and let me also reiterate my gratitude to Global Affairs Canada for funding this research project. We couldn't have done it without you. I also want to acknowledge my co-authors and research assistants on this project, Julia, Daniel, Amina, and Diamond, who've done fantastic work with me, and I want to make sure they get their share of praise. So in terms of the key findings of the report and what stood out to us, it was really the issue of impunity and the lack of accountability. So as already mentioned, we have the 2021 coup last year, but that coup didn't come out of nowhere. There is a thread connecting the acts of genocide in 2017 and violence that goes further even in 2012 and decades before that, that all kind of are connected. And so what we see and what comes out of this report is really the failure of the international community to hold the Tatmadaw accountable for the targeted and systematic sexual violence against the Rohingya and other minoritized groups. And that lack of accountability from the international community has really contributed to a culture of impunity that emboldens Tatmadaw officials, commanders, and individual soldiers to use sexual violence in a concerted and deliberate way. And so, as the SRSG already mentioned, the Women, Peace and Security agenda, one of the central pillars is protection, and protection against conflict-related sexual violence has been emphasized over the last 2 decades. As the SRSG mentioned, there have been 5 resolutions that specifically address conflict-related sexual violence, but unfortunately, so much of that has been rhetorical, and there has been a lack of action, as we've seen in Myanmar, in Ethiopia, and now in Ukraine. And what we do not see is the type of action, concerted, strategic, coordinated, that makes sure that our actions and our commitments live up to the aspirations of the WPS agenda. And I want to emphasize that here in Myanmar, as well as in other contexts such as Ukraine, conflict-related sexual violence is part of a bigger picture of human rights abuses. And we must be careful not to fetishize and singularly focus on conflict-related sexual violence. One reason why it's important specifically to focus on conflict-related sexual violence, though, is that when we see reports of sexual violence, we often see an escalation of other forms of violence following. So reports of sexual violence can become like the canary in the coal mine that warn us of things to come. And so that's what we saw in Myanmar, right? The genocide in 2017 and the thread connecting acts of violence against minoritized and marginalized communities, different ethnic communities, and how that culture of impunity that came out of that emboldened the Tatmadaw to seize power in 2021. And so protection against conflict-related sexual violence is really important, not just for women, but also for men and boys who are often targeted, and other marginalized group, whether they're part of the LGBTQI community or part of ethnic groups that are historically disenfranchised and marginalized. Having said that the protection is so important, we want to make sure we do protection right. And so accountability and ending impunity is part of that, but a bigger part arguably has to be empowering women and empowering marginalized groups, because we don't want to reinforce gendered hierarchies that give more power to already powerful men. And supposedly that power is supposed to help protect women, but often it's abused. And so we want to focus on empowering marginalized communities rather than just focusing on protection. And part of that has to be a comprehensive, gender responsive, gender transformative strategy. And so it's really encouraging to see governments from Canada to France, Sweden, Mexico, and now Germany to embark on feminist foreign policies and putting that into action. And so we have a few recommendations coming out of this report and our work that I want to present here. And first and foremost, it is really making sure that there are direct consultations and direct bilateral aid to civil society groups and civil society activists, especially in the context of Myanmar, where previously NGOs, civil society groups had to register with the government and therefore were co-opted and often curtailed in what they could do. So making sure the consultations and the aid happens on a direct bilateral basis is key. The other thing I want to emphasize is that a lot of the governments, including the US government, the Canadian government, the UK government, already have certain policy tools and laws in place, such as in the US, the Global Magnitsky Act, that allows them to tailor sanctions, human rights-based and corruption-based sanction regimes to individuals and organizations that are not affiliated with the state. And making better and more creative use of these tools and these laws is really important. And it's particularly important in the context of Myanmar, because the Tatmadaw currently have no local legitimacy, they have no international legitimacy, but they crave it, they need it. And so denying them this type of legitimacy is important, and the Global Magnitsky Act and similar laws can play a role in that, because they are specifically designed to target non-state actors. And so using tools like that sends an implicit and explicit signal to the Tatmadaw and everyone else in the international community that we do not recognize the Tatmadaw as a legitimate state actor. They are a non-state actor and we treat them as such. And part of the human rights-based sanction regimes and one of our key recommendations is that their governments should institute automatic sort of responses and triggers. For example, the SRSG mentioned that over 70% of individuals and organizations listed in the annual report of the Secretary General on Sexual Violence and Armed Conflict are repeat offenders who have been on the list for 5 or more years. So we propose that as national governments revise their women, peace, and security national action plans, revise their human rights-based sanction regimes, one of the provisions that they should consider is, can we set up something where if you're listed, if a group, an organization, an entity is listed repeatedly as an offender for multiple years, does that trigger automatic sanctions, right? Something that basically becomes automatic, as I said. The other thing that is also relevant, not just for Myanmar, but in Ukraine and in the case of Russia's aggression, is targeting the right sectors. and in particular, oil and gas. One of the key things, one of the key resources Myanmar's Tatmadaw continues to rely on is their oil and gas sector in funding their operations and keeping their vehicles, their helicopters, their planes running, right? And so one of the key recommendations is to target the right sectors, making sure to deny them the funds and the operational capabilities to do what they do. And then I want to close with, again, focusing on civil society and civil society actors and making sure we consider what they want and what they need. We've heard from other reports in other contexts that many survivors do not look for criminal prosecution as much as they look for other types of support. And that's where the economic empowerment, the strength giving to survivors really comes in. And I want to close with one question that I asked the civil society activists that I talked to for this report, and I think it's really important, especially in this context, and that is, I asked them, if you could speak through me, if you had the ear of policymakers, decision makers, well, what would you tell them? And they said, don't forget about us. Don't forget about us in Myanmar. Don't forget about the important work we do. We need the international community to continue to pay attention to us. And I want to leave you with that and hand it over to Wai Wai. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Rob, for that excellent overview of the report and the recommendations. As you said, we're going to turn now to Wai Wai Nu, who is a leading voice for human rights and peace in Myanmar, a long-standing and courageous advocate on behalf of women and girls in the Rohingya community. She is the founder and executive director of the Women Peace Network, which conducts training around civic engagement in Rakhine State, and is the founder of the Yangon Youth Leadership Center. She also worked for justice for women in Yangon. We were very proud to present Wai Wai Nu with the Institute's Trailblazer Award a few years ago. Much deserved, Wai Wai, and you continue to do really important work in this space. Let me ask you, across Myanmar, the military continues to act with impunity, and there's been no international accountability for the sexual violence that goes on. What should the international community be doing that it's not doing? The United States, as you well know, because you advocated for it for some time, has declared a genocide, that Myanmar committed genocide. The Myanmar's military committed genocide there. What has to happen now? Are these mere declarations, or is there something that truly needs to come out of this? Is this added, are these added tools that can now make a difference? So how can the Tatmadaw be held accountable?
Thank you very much, Ambassador Vivia. Thank you for the opportunity to join this discussion today. As you and previous speakers have noted, measures to end sexual violence and hold its perpetrators accountable are needed now more than ever. And referring to the Institute recent report that just that the Bob summarized, we all agree that the international community can realize this through its concerted and comprehensive actions. These actions will also bring justice to the victims and survivors of these crimes, many of whom have been waiting for months, years, if not decades. It has been the reality for the people of Myanmar to the Ukraine, and they're bearing the brunt of the impunity that has fueled their violators for far too long. In the case of Myanmar, the militaries continue to commit strategic and widespread attack of sexual violence against women, men, and LGBTQI+ community. As you mentioned, for decades, the Myanmar military has perpetrated the most brutal form of sexual violence against the ethnic minorities, including the Rohingya. The UN fact-finding missions, the UN independent international fact-finding missions on Myanmar, in fact, reported in 2018 that the sexual violence has been the hallmark of the military's operations, particularly in genocidal attacks against Rohingya in 2017. Noting this, the US government recent determinations of the Myanmar militaries against the Rohingya is truly appreciated. The recognitions of the crimes as what they are have been gives hope to the Rohingya victims and survivors, including myself, but it is definitely not enough. And we must not forget today the ongoing humanitarian and political crisis is preventing the safe and dignified return of the Rohingya women, children, and their community members to Myanmar. As we speak, the Myanmar military continue to commit atrocities against the Rohingya and other ethnic minorities, as well as to the country's entire populations. Sexual violence continues to be the hallmark of the military's campaign of terror. As was reported by my organization's Women's Peace Network, women and girls in detentions and areas of the armed conflicts remain at serious risks of being subjected to this brutality. So we believe that holding Myanmar military accountable is the only way, and is the only way Myanmar and the victims and survivors of such heinous crimes can move forward. Referring to your institute recent report, the international community's support is essential for making this happen. First, countries must impose coordinated financial penalties and economic sanctions on the Myanmar military and its related businesses. As you shared last time at the National Unity's Government Women's International Women's Days panel this year, this should include the Myanmar's oil and gas enterprise. Sanctions are crucial in cutting the military's lifeline, which has fueled its atrocities for decades. In addressing one of the root causes of the military's decade-long power, sanction will lessen the possibility of its recurrence of sexual violence and other atrocity crimes in Myanmar. Countries such as the United States and Canada should continue to pursuing these sanctions, now in accordance with the Global Magnitsky Act and the Justice for Victims of Corrupt Regime Official Act. Simultaneously, countries must impose arms embargo on Myanmar. Many of these cases of sexual violence in Myanmar today are being committed in the areas of armed conflicts. And in one of the tools that fuel the Myanmar's military's ability to commit these crimes is a step forward to preventing its recommission. And more comprehensive and economic sanctions and global arms embargo can be implemented by the UN Security Council resolution. While the Council's full cooperation for Myanmar is unlikely given its current composition, we must continue to push for what it is mandated to do. However, preventing the further recurrence of such crimes is not enough to end the military's impunity. The victims and survivors of these crimes must also be served the justice they wish to see, through its resolution, UN Security Council should refer to Myanmar to the International Criminal Court as one of the most important international accountability mechanisms Pursuing this is a critical step in ending military's impunity and prosecuting the entirety of its crimes. These mechanisms must be also rooted in the full engagement and inclusions of the victims and survivors of such atrocities, particularly sexual violence. At the same time, the international community must support ongoing part to the Myanmar's accountability processes, including the work of the UN independent investigations mechanisms for Myanmar and the special reporter on Myanmar's human rights situations, as well as the International Court of Justice Rohingya genocide case. Counsel Sulaiman, who is here with us today, and his effort for the Gambia are sincerely welcome in this context. Countries also should exercise their universal jurisdictions for the international crimes and gross human rights violations, including sexual violence committed by the Myanmar military. These accountability mechanisms should also serve the purpose of recognizing the pain and suffering of the victims and survivors of such crimes. More countries should also work towards officially recognizing atrocities as it is, as was done by the Canada in 2018 and US government recently. Lastly, just a couple of points. The government should not engage with the Myanmar military, and they should disengage with the Myanmar military, basically. Additionally, the international community should bolster their support for the country's civil society, as was mentioned by Barop, providing direct financial and material support of need. In this context, I thank to the Director General Macdonald emphasis on this point, as well as commitment to continue such important actions. Women's groups and community-based organizations and other Myanmar CSO are truly expert for their respective communities and are often the only source of support for the victims and survivors of the military crimes. By documenting and reporting on these crimes, the work of these organizations will help develop for the world and approach that reflect the reality on the ground. This approach is crucial for the international community to issue and implement measures that will effectively address the need and concerns for the truly deserved populations. Lastly, now more than ever, the international community must take concerted and comprehensive actions to hold the military accountable for its decades-long crimes, particularly sexual violence. And in impunity for the violators is the only way justice can be done, served to the victims and survivors. Today, the people of Myanmar, alongside the people of Ukraine, are risking everything to make that happen. So now it is the world's turn to not to listen to them, but truly act in solidarity. Thank you very much, Ambassador.
Thank you so much, Wai Wai Nu. And thanks for laying out all those avenues of important actions that need to be taken. Hopefully, they will be pursued more vigorously than they have been. Hold tight. When we get through our panelists' initial remarks, we'll come back for questions from the audience. We're going to turn now to Alexandra Mcmitchuk, who's a Ukrainian human rights lawyer and civil society leader. She directs the Center for Civil Liberties, which is overseeing the painful effort to document atrocities committed across Ukraine, including sexual violence as a weapon of war. She's been documenting war crimes since Russia invaded Crimea back in 2014, and that work has only taken on greater intensity with the subsequent invasion in February. She's been an active campaigner for democratic reforms in Ukraine and the OSCE region, including as a member of the advisory board on the human rights of the Office of the Ombudsman of Ukraine. Alexandra is one of the leading human rights activists who also advocates for international support for Ukraine at this critical time and prosecution of Russia's war crimes. She is joining us from Kiev. Welcome, Alexandra. We are very happy to have you with us to give us your firsthand account of what is happening there. I know it's devastating, no less the growing reports of sexual violence that is being perpetrated by the Russian forces and used as a weapon of the ongoing war. Perhaps you can give us a sense of the realities on the ground, what you and others are asking of the international community, and what you and other organizations are doing to document these crimes so that you will have the evidence for future prosecutions. So can you walk us through all of that?
Thank you very much for providing me a floor. It's a great honor to have participate in this panel. After the full-scale Russian invasion in February started, we resumed the Euromaidan SOS initiative and united several hundred volunteers who are gathering testimonies of victims of the war crimes from all around the country. During our work, we received the information from several women who were raped by Russian soldiers in the Sumy, Kharkiv, and Kiev regions. Since most of our volunteers are not trained to interview the survivors of sexual violence, we work on these cases in the close cooperations with organizations who specialize in it. I know from my own experience, because I have been documented war crimes for 8 years already, that sexual violence during war is the most hidden crime. People who survive it quite often don't report it to police and are not ready to talk about it even with the human rights defenders because of their understanding of rape as a shame crime. Therefore, we will see more information only after complete liberation of Kherson, Donetsk, Lugansk, Zaporizhia, Kharkiv, and other regions of Ukraine, which for now are partially occupied by Russian troops, and the town of Mariupol in particular, and most likely only after a significant amount of time passes. Thus, our first conclusion is the following. When even our volunteer initiative, who not focus only on such cases, is getting approached by the victims of rape by Russian soldiers, it indicates a widespread nature of the sexual violence. More information about sexual violence started to surface after liberation of the Kiev region at the end of March. The Office of Ombudsman officially states about mass and regular rapes by Russian soldiers during occupation of towns and villages of the Kiev region. Some of these women are pregnant. These rapes have often been accompanied by murder and by causing physical harm to victims. Their teeth were knocked out, limbs broken, sex organs seriously injured. Unfortunately, children, both boys and girls, also fall victims of the sexual violence of Russian armed forces. Often, rapes happened in the presence of victims' children, their relatives or acquaintances, and were accompanied by explicit demonstration of disdain of Russians towards civilians. This way, through specific victims, sexual violence is directed toward the Ukrainian society in general to evoke feelings of shame in victims, feeling of guilt in those who weren't able to defend them, feelings of fear of getting the same treatment in others, and as a result, to weaken social connections and make it easier to establish control over the communities. Thus, our second conclusion is the following. Sexual violence is a method of Russian warfare. These rapes are part of a policy of terror against civilian population, purposefully introduced by Russian army to break the nonviolent resistance and establish control over the region. All of this raises a question on how the international community should respond. And first and foremost, Russian aggression must be stopped to prevent new war crimes and new victims. And Ukraine needs weapons for this. The example of Bucha has demonstrated to the whole world that Russia is killing those who are unarmed. Ukraine needs long-range air defense systems such as NASAMS, military jets, artillery system, tanks, armored vehicles, etc. Also, effective economic sanctions must be imposed and meticulously monitored as well. In particular, disconnect all Russian banks from SWIFT and impose a complete embargo on Russian energy. If Russian oil and gas are not banned now, the average annual price of the Russian oil, including discounts and reduction in export volumes, is going to be around $75 per barrel. It would allow the Kremlin to finance all expenses, including conduction hostilities, for at least 2 years. Second, Ukraine's effort on ensuring justice must be supported. The EU, the US, the UK, and other UN member states should stand behind Ukraine and the International Criminal Court to facilitate investigations and prosecution of those responsible for war crimes and crimes against humanity committed during Russian war against Ukraine, through the creation of international mechanisms and instruments in addition to investigation and delivery of justice at the domestic level. Since the ICC can't exercise its jurisdiction over the crime of aggression, UN members should stand up for Ukraine's efforts to establish the special tribunal for the Russian aggression against Ukraine and take institutional decisions to timely implement all initiatives. And third, it's necessary to ensure international presence and fulfill the mandate of international organizations on the ground. With the beginning of the full-scale Russian aggression, most of international organizations evacuated their employees abroad or to more safe Western regions of Ukraine. But we need from the EU, from the UN, OSCE, and Council of Europe to ensure international presence and monitoring in war zones, occupied cities during evacuation of civilians, and to take active measures to assist and to protect civilians. Thank you.
Thank you, Alexandra. And that was obviously consistent with much of what we've heard already, but this time really particularly in terms of what's needed in Ukraine. We're going to go through the questions and answers momentarily, and I'm sure there will be many questions to you in the process. But before we do that, I want to turn to Arsalan Suleiman, who is currently the counsel in the International Court of Justice in the case on the Rohingya genocide in Myanmar. He is a leading counsel at Foley Ho's International Litigation and Arbitration practice, which focuses on representing states in international tribunal disputes in forums like the ICJ. He has previously served as the acting special envoy to the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, where he represented the United States to advance areas of mutual interest, including countering violent extremism and promoting human rights. He also served as the counselor for multilateral affairs in the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights and Labor at the State Department, DRL. Arsalan, it's good for you to be with us also. You have experience in the courts, so I'm sure that experience will be brought to bear in your discussion with us. As the counsel at ICJ, you have firsthand knowledge about how the international mechanism can be deployed to support accountability for violations of human rights. What is the role of international prosecution and the role of ICJ as a tool to address sexual violence?
Thank you, Ambassador Brevier, for that very generous introduction. And thank you as well to your colleagues at the Georgetown Institute for Women, Peace, and Security, and to all the panelists today who've really given really excellent remarks and really enjoyed listening to their presentations. Accountability is absolutely critical to providing justice to the victims. It's also vital to establishing truth, because often in these conflict situations, the perpetrator denies the reality of what has been happening. And in many cases, like for the Rohingya and for Ukrainians, their very identities are being denied as well as part of these efforts. And that the conflict-related sexual violence is in fact part and parcel of that effort to deny their very existence and their chosen identity. Also, ending impunity is critical to helping to prevent these types of acts of sexual violence in the future. There are two ways of looking at the issue of accountability. The first is individual criminal responsibility, and the second is state responsibility. On the issue of individual criminal responsibility, usually domestic law is the first option. But for various reasons, this is limited. And the main reason is in contexts like in Myanmar, where the violence is primarily taking place within the country, oftentimes these domestic systems are marred by systems of impunity and long-standing cultures of impunity, which prevent accountability from happening at the domestic level. However, in the case of Ukraine, we actually have an interesting opportunity in the fact that the Russian crimes that are happening are occurring on the territory of Ukraine. And so there is opportunity for Ukraine to exercise its own domestic jurisdiction in order to prosecute certain individual criminals who are responsible for conflict-related sexual violence, as well as for other war crimes. And we've seen so much evidence of that coming forward as various parts of the country are being liberated. Second, aside from domestic law options, you have international criminal mechanisms. Many of us are familiar of the history of tribunals like the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, as well as the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda. These are criminal tribunals that were created by acts of the United Nations Security Council. The International Criminal Court, which I think everyone is very familiar with as well, is a court that was established by virtue of an international statute, the Rome Statute. And states that are party to that statute have given the court jurisdiction over certain crimes that have been committed or may be committed in the future that fall within the statute's jurisdiction. And the ICC can also be referred in certain situations. So even in cases where a state is not a party to that statute, the Security Council could act to refer a situation that the council feels merits the ICC's attention. It could refer that situation directly to the council in order, directly to the court in order for the prosecutor to investigate and potentially file charges against those responsible. In the Myanmar context, Myanmar is not a party to the International Criminal Court, and therefore having the ICC fully investigate the situation, that could only happen if the Security Council were to refer the full situation of Myanmar to the court. However, the prosecutor has opened an investigation into certain crimes that were completed on the territory of Bangladesh, the neighboring state of Bangladesh, because Bangladesh is a party to the ICC, and therefore crimes that were completed on its territory may fall within that court's jurisdiction. Ukraine has referred the situation there and Russia's potential crimes that are occurring on Ukraine's territory to the International Criminal Court. And so we understand that the prosecutor is actively working to open that investigation. And finally, in terms of individual criminal responsibility, there's another avenue in terms of using individualized targeted sanctions, like the Magnitsky Act, which has been mentioned before. In terms of state responsibility, the options here are more limited because of state sovereignty, which is one of the bedrock principles under international law. And so unless a state has voluntarily ceded its or given consent to a certain court or a certain tribunal, generally sovereignty would protect it from being prosecuted or being brought to a court as a state. Now, the main exception to this is the International Court of Justice, which is the United Nations highest court. It's often referred to as the World Court. And many states, either by generalized indications of an assent to the court's jurisdiction or by particularized consent to the court's jurisdiction with particular treaties, for example, specific treaties like the Genocide Convention, which provide the court with jurisdiction. Those types of affirmations of a country's consent allows the court then to potentially hear claims of a state's violations of that particular treaty. Now, of course, that's limited. There isn't, unfortunately, a treaty related to conflict-related sexual violence, for example, which would give the ICJ jurisdiction to address these types of violations that are occurring and that could be attributed to the state itself. But there are treaties like the Genocide Convention, which established genocide as an international crime. And as we all know, both in the context of Myanmar and also, I think increasingly we're becoming aware in the context of Ukraine, that rape and conflict-related sexual violence has been used as part of the policy of genocide. Certainly that's the case in Myanmar, where horrific acts of brutal rape, mass rape was systematically imposed on the Rohingya and was part and parcel of the state's genocidal policies. So as part of the Gambia's case against Myanmar, the conflict-related sexual violence is an integral part of that case because it is evidence of the genocidal intent that the Myanmar state had vis-a-vis its violent actions against the Rohingya. Now, Ambassador Verveer asked, how can we strengthen these accountability mechanisms? So one way to strengthen it is to strengthen and authorize fact-finding and evidence-gathering efforts. In the Myanmar context, the United Nations fact-finding mission, which was authorized and dispatched by the UN Human Rights Council, was really essential in gathering a lot of the frontline evidence from the victims regarding the genocide against the Rohingya. And these types of mechanisms are really important because if investigators can get the evidence and can use their expertise in investigating these types of crimes, meaning they can have the type of cultural and victim-related sensibilities that was raised by Alexandra, for example, and Wai Wai as well, that can help ensure that the evidence is gathered in an effective and a meaningful way. And there are certain mechanisms like the Independent International Investigative Mechanism for Syria, which is doing this type of work for the Syria conflict. And also in the Myanmar context, the International Investigative Mechanism for Myanmar has also been created and dispatched by the Human Rights Council to investigate those crimes. So these types of mechanisms are really important and could be strengthened and authorized in other contexts as well. Secondly, we need to increase the efforts for domestic legal reforms and national institutions. We heard from UN Special Representative Patten on this and how her office is working on this issue. But I want to emphasize this because even though in certain countries, like for example, in Myanmar, where there really isn't any hope for justice within the domestic system now, that may not be the case in the future. There may be a future, hopefully, I certainly hope so, but it may take time, but there may be a future in which there's a new government in Myanmar, which would have the initiative and authority and desire to fully have accountability and justice for the victims, including for victims of conflict-related sexual violence. So those domestic legal reforms are important so that the legal mechanisms are in place when there are actors who are willing to use them. And also on the domestic reform element, I think it's important for other states to also expand their domestic jurisdiction to allow for the prosecution of these crimes on a universal jurisdiction basis. We've seen Germany being really a leader in this space as it has prosecuted ISIS perpetrators of the Yazidi genocide, including the sexual related violence there. They've also prosecuted Syrian criminals who have perpetrated violence against Syrians in the context of that ongoing internal conflict. And so the more national jurisdictions allow for that prosecution, the less space there is for these perpetrators to escape accountability in the long term. Third, I want to mention that we should also work to increase the pathways for enforcing state responsibility. So the legal options, like under the Genocide Convention, are but one option. And those tools are important to create. And hopefully we can see treaties that would create more opportunities for enforcing that state responsibility. But there are also other tools that could also be deployed in order to target and enforce state responsibility. And again, Special Representative Patten mentioned some of these, which include targeted sanctions and other diplomatic repercussions. And the final point I want to make is that fourth, we should also activate regional organizations to leverage their capacity to enforce the norms of accountability. So Alexandra has mentioned institutions like the OSCE and the Council of Europe. These are critical in the context of Ukraine. In the context of Myanmar, ASEAN is an important regional body that should do a lot more in terms of its efforts to promote accountability and put pressure on Myanmar in order to end the conflict and hold those accountable for that violence. Regional bodies could establish regional justice mechanisms, but they could also institute travel bans, enforce sanctions, and impose other type of restrictions. Thank you very much for this opportunity. I look forward to the continued question and answer session. Thank you.
That was excellent, Arsenal, and thank you for walking us through the various forums that exist to bring prosecutorial actions on this issue. We're going to turn now to our audience for their questions. And Ali, can you give us those, please?
Sure. This first question is for Alexandra, but I think all can answer. How can international organizations best support your organization? And how can civil society organizations in general work in coordination with the various multilateral organizations and UN systems to prevent and respond to conflict-related sexual violence?
Thank you very much. I will start it with the response, and I will provide two theses. First, we need international organizations like the UN, the Council of Europe, and the OSCE to return and to work to the ground. We need them urgently in the occupied cities where Russian troops provide a terror against civilians, and we recorded enforced disappearances, rapes, killings, and tortures of active representative of civil society. We need them also during evacuation of civilians, which is under Russian challenge, to see and to monitor what's going on their own eyes. And we need them in the war zone, like to stand shoulder to shoulder with us and to provide protection and assistance to civilian population. So we ask them to fulfill their mandate, not from Geneva, Vienna, or Warsaw, or other capitals, but from the ground where their mandate and their efforts are most essential and necessity. And second, maybe it sounds very strange that me as a human rights lawyer ask for weapons for Ukraine. But the problem is that I spent 20 years for a law instrument. And now I see that the whole international system of Hague and Geneva Convention lays in ruins, like Ukrainian Mariupol, Kharkiv, and Chernihiv. So in order to survive, we need to do some actions and we need assistance of international community. What do I mean? That for me as a human rights defender, it's not only a question how to properly provide documentation of war crimes and crimes against humanity and how to provide assistance of the victims of sexual violence, but how to stop these war crimes to commit, how to prevent the new victims to emerge. This is the most difficult question. And in order to do it, we need your advocacy efforts, because we need not half-hearted economical sanctions, which we have for current moment, but such kind of sanction which can stop the ability of Russian economy to feed this war, and a lot of more. So please, we need your assistance also in justice and to bring to perpetrators to accountability, but also we need your assistance in stopping the war and withdrawing the Russian troops from Ukraine. Thank you.
Thank you. Does anybody else want to take that question on? Otherwise, we will go to the next one. And Alexandra, let me ask you, is the OSCE doing anything along the grounds that you just laid out?
OSCE is a consensus mechanism, and that's why they are very limited in their efforts. and it's ineffective, unfortunately, for current moment, because the OSCE mission was provided a veto by Russia and stopped their functioning. So they couldn't restore the work of OSCE monitoring mission on the ground. OSCE launched a Moscow mechanism in early March, and we sent submissions to Moscow mechanism. But it's also distance investigation, which have all very preliminary conclusion and even no strict recommendation to the state participant of OSCE. So it's a crisis issue for OSCE itself as an organization, what they can do and for current moment, and how they can rebuild their internal infrastructure in order to be more effective in the future crisis. Thank you.
No, and I think you show some of the impediments that are dogging some of our regional and international organizations. In this case, the mandate for consensus to proceed, and then Russia saying no more special monitoring mission. Wai Wai Nu, did you want to come in on that as well?
Yes, thank you. So I think there are ways that international organizations such as United Nations or intergovernmental organizations could approach in such a serious conflict situations. One way is, yes, of course, it's obvious, like which is like emergency response, like urgent response, providing humanitarian aids to other forms of support, and that is needed in the case of Myanmar or Ukraine, or Afghanistan and so on. It's not enough in Myanmar. Military has been limiting access to those conflict-affected areas against the international organizations, and those emergency response and urgent supports are essential for life-saving purposes. But at the same time, I think there is a second approach and second way that international communities can support the local communities, affected communities and organizations. That is having a long-term strategy and approach for the long-term support and rebuilding the communities of these international crimes, such as genocides, war crimes, and crimes against humanity, and in particular the victims of sexual violence. And I think the second approach has been somehow lost in the translations, and there hasn't been enough attempt or approach ongoing, in not only in the case of Myanmar, but also elsewhere. There aren't enough support systems available for the internet. I think there are effective or strong approach and strategy put in place by the international big organizations to the communities to provide, to have a direct support systems, or to the mechanisms or the approach that effectively give a lot of agencies to the community so that they can rebuild their community, and the approaches and the supports are sustainable. Like, for example, as I mentioned earlier in my remark, providing direct support to the local organizations and local groups, and direct technical support, and respecting their expertise and expert opinions and their strategy. Oftentimes, the communities are the one who knows how to respond to the situations and how to rebuild their community. So I think valuing their knowledges and their expertise, as well as effectively equipping them with the necessary support system, financial and technical, as well as having more programming strategies through the local international organizations on education, skill building, and so that it will sustain with the community for them to rebuild their life. In the case of sexual violence, so in Bangladesh refugee camps, there are many survivors and victims still living there. You know, some of them are continue their life with the babies born out of rape, and there aren't any support system available for them at all. And a lot of the support were there at the beginning when they moved. When they fled from Myanmar, there were, you know, emergency health care and etc. But after that, there is nothing available, and there has to be, I think, there is a huge need for that to fill that gap and to really focus on long-term support and sustaining the community and rebuilding the life of the communities affected.
Thank you. Good point. Allie.
Sure, we'll do two here. There's a lot of questions coming in about the Tigray crisis and applications to that. The question here is for Arsalan. What of the instruments that you mentioned could have the most significant impact on sexual violence in the Tigray crisis? Might you be able to apply your analysis from Myanmar and Ukraine to this conflict? And the second question is on reporting. A lot of sexual violence goes unreported because of the risks to doing so. How can we foster a better environment of trust for survivors to speak out?
Okay, Arsalan, why don't you start?
Okay, thanks. I'll take the first part of the question because I think maybe Wai Wai or Alexandra might be better placed to answer the second part of that question. But certainly in Tigray, I'm familiar with the Amnesty International report and other reports of really horrific conflict-related sexual violence, including those that may be at the level of crimes against humanity. I think there's definitely a need to encourage investigative mechanisms or potentially create investigative mechanisms so that the evidence here and the victims' testimonies could be preserved and used for future prosecutions. I think there's probably an important role that regional organizations can play. For example, the African Commission for Human and People's Rights or other mechanisms under the African Union in order to work to potentially create or enforce some sort of accountability mechanisms. But I think here as well, we also need to potentially deploy broader reactions such as trade restrictions, which I think the United States has already done, but also potentially sanctions in order to ensure that those units and entities that are engaging in these types of war crimes and violations are held responsible. And targeted sanctions could also put pressure on the government, the Ethiopian government, to prevent these violations from occurring. So I think, you know, one step is certainly the evidence gathering step, but the second step is looking at various platforms and mechanisms that may be able to have jurisdiction in order to potentially help with the accountability element to follow on these crimes.
Thank you. Alexandra, do you want to take the second part of that question, given the unreported nature of many of these crimes?
There is a strategy for long run and for short run. For short run, now we try to provide information and campaign for whom survivors of sexual violence can apply even anonymously and in confidential way receive medical, psychological and other kind of assistance. And we deeply respect the rights of survivors of sexual violence not to apply to police or provide testimonies if he or she don't want to do it, because the priority is to provide assistance to survivors of sexual violence. And if we speak about, and this is become extremely difficult because now we have a huge flee civilians from Ukraine. More than 5 million people have left the country, and majority of them are in Poland, where the national legislation of abortion is much more strict than in Ukraine. And now we, together with our Poland colleagues, started this informational campaign in Poland. Because in Poland, the pregnant women couldn't provide abortion for free. They can do it only in several exceptions, like if the women were raped. And in this regard, when we speak about sexual violence in the war, it's become extremely difficult for women to prove that they were raped on Ukrainian territories by Russian soldiers, etc. So we found a temporary solution to cover by informational campaign also Poland territories and speak with Ukrainian refugees there for whom they can apply also anonymously for Polish initiatives. And if they need such a medical intervention as abortion, they can be transferred to another countries which such abortion is legal. But if we speak about long-term policy, I totally believe that we need a special sexual education among society, and all our efforts to provide a real gender equality will also play essential role in make this crime not so shameful. That's why when the war will stop, but it will stop sooner or later, I think that Ukraine as a state have underestimate their approach and to do a prevention measure on a state level of increasing awarenesses about sexual education. Thank you.
Okay, Ali, we have a little bit of time left. Do you have another question?
Sure. We have a couple from U.S. policymakers at the State Department and Department of Defense asking what are the top ways the U.S. can advance this effort, and another on how can the U.S. uphold its commitment to the implementation of women, peace, and security and international human rights when we do not recognize the ICC as the vessel for carrying out such proceedings.
Excellent. Who wants to take that? Okay, Rob.
Yeah, great questions. And so one of the key things that the US can do, for example, specifically to the second question in terms of the women, peace, and security agenda, is when it revises its national action plan, it can take specific steps. For example, as I mentioned, one opportunity would be to put in a clause that when there are entities, whether that's a national military, individual groups, or individuals themselves, are listed for consecutive years in the Secretary General report on sexual violence and armed conflict, that it automatically triggers the application of the Global Magnitsky Act, right? And that is one step. The other is, and that was actually applied previously in Myanmar as part of a sanctions regime, and the good people at the Century have advocated for this for a while, and that is responsible investment reporting requirements. So if a company invests above a certain threshold in a country, it has to file publicly available due diligence reports of where they're investing, how they're investing, who's benefiting from that. And that becomes an important tool, or can become an important tool for human rights advocates and activists to put public pressure on companies. And it had been really effective in Myanmar, and that is part of one possibility for the US government to reinstitute these type of reporting requirements for Myanmar and for other contexts. Let me stop here. I saw Arsalan raise his hand. I think he can speak to the International Criminal Court and ICJ far better than I could.
Take it on, Arsalan.
Okay, well, Rob, I didn't want to interrupt you. I just wanted to flag that I did want to, weigh in on that ICC part in terms of US support. I think this is a critical area where US policy has really been a bit schizophrenic. I mean, initially, President Clinton had signed the statute, then President George W. Bush unsigned it. Under the Obama administration, the US was supporting the prosecutor in certain investigations and helping to bring certain individuals to justice. Then under the Trump administration, the United States was actively imposing sanctions and travel restrictions and visa restrictions on the ICC prosecutor and her staff. I think it's really shameful in terms of how US policy has unfolded vis-a-vis the ICC. And my hope is that the Biden administration really takes a close look at how the US can have a long-term positive, constructive relationship of supporting the ICC and its important efforts. And because we've seen political parties and politicians on both sides of the aisle in the United States talk about the crucial importance of accountability in the context of Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine. And I think that context and the brutal crimes we're seeing there, it really has brought to light for many of these political actors the need for accountability mechanisms. And when you have one that's so perfectly placed in the ICC, because Ukraine has asked the prosecutor to take on this case and has given it the jurisdiction, it makes no sense for the US to be somehow in tension or in opposition to that institution. And in fact, I think it's in America's interest in terms of long-term promotion of accountability in order to support the institution in various ways. And so I definitely think there's a need for a long-term reform in the United States' approach to its relationship with the ICC and in supporting the prosecutor in his investigations, not only in Ukraine, but also vis-a-vis other important situations. And that may even include situations like the Tigray situation, which many of the viewers have been commenting upon.
That's going to have to be the last word, Arsalan, but I can't think of a more important question because this has come up repeatedly now, not just in terms of the United States, but particularly in terms of the United States, which, as you pointed out, depending on the administration, has had a different view of exactly what our role has been with respect to the ICC, which looms increasingly as critically important. So thank you for walking us through that. Unfortunately, we have run out of time, as happens all too often, but this has been an extraordinarily important discussion. I think it's critical to anybody who has been listening or working on this issue that sexual violence in conflict deserves greater accountability than it's been getting, and that critically important to that, it is an integral part of warfare today. It is not collateral damage in a war. It is the weapon of choice by many of those who are engaged in carrying out the war. So we need greater accountability. And I'm grateful to all of you on behalf of the Institute for your participation, because this is certainly an issue of the moment with great urgency upon us. So thanks to each of one of you. I want to thank the SRSG, Pramila Patten, for her strong leadership on these issues, to Lynn McDonald and Canada's leadership, to you, Wai Wai Nu, to Alexandra Mcmitchuk, to Arsalan Suleiman, and to our own Dr. Rob Nagle for the excellent report. We all have a great deal of work to do in the weeks ahead, and I hope we will be fully engaged because, as one of you said, we need the strongest advocacy and much more. So thank you all.